Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Snake and the Spider, a true story of abduction and murder in Daytona Beach, by Kingsbury, narrated by Nikki Zakocs. A note from Kingsbury. The story you are about to read was adapted from my days as a news reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Sadly, the characters in this story are real. In most cases, the dialogue and events are real. Some scenes have been recreated to better tell the story. Always the chapters were difficult to write, a very real look at the darker side of life. Missy's Murder was the first of 4 true crime books I wrote at the beginning of my career as an author. It allowed me to be home with my daughter, Kelsey, who was just an infant when I covered the trial. I wrote 3 more: Final Vows, Deadly Pretender, and Snake and the Spider. After that, I decided I couldn't write another. I'd explored enough of the dark side. All of my novels since then contain characters with serious trials and troubles, but they are written in context of the faith, light, and hope that I believe exists for all of us, including the characters in this book. God bless. Kingsbury. Author's Explanatory Note. The events described in this book are taken directly from court transcripts and other public records and documents, as well as from numerous interviews with the many people involved. In many instances, however, to better communicate the story and the atmosphere surrounding the events, incidents and dialogue have been dramatically recreated based on court testimony and other public records and interviews with various participants or other knowledgeable individuals. Snake's wife, Sandra, Mike Black and Rob, Jeff Kindle, Dick Kane, and the names of other minor characters are all pseudonyms. The author has chosen to change these names and disguise the identities of certain people involved in this story. This has been done to preserve privacy. Any similarity between the fictitious names and those of living persons is, of course, entirely coincidental. The people you're about to meet. Jim and Daryl didn't know what waited for them. The Spider, a loser, a biker, a kid with no conscience. What secret did he know that could break a parent's heart in 2? What deal was he willing to make to tell it? The Snake, a thief, a drug dealer, a pagan leader. Where did he get Daryl's red Chevy Nova and traveler's checks signed by Jim? Bob Brown, a dedicated private eye who prayed before taking this case. What did he find out in a run-down trailer park that made his blood run cold? Larry, a fearless red-haired giant and a biker on his own. Could he find the person called Fat Man and the clue that would break the case? Sandra, a pretty 23-year-old who was married to a man called Snake. What was her birthday present that was paid for in blood? Murray Ziegler, a hard-nosed homicide detective. Why was he finally brought into the case of the missing boys? What sickening facts did he suspect or know? Some poisonous creatures are human. Chapter 1. Fay Boucher hummed quietly to herself as she made French toast in the kitchen of her rambling country home that August 12th, 1978. This was going to be a special breakfast, the last one she would cook for her oldest son Jim before he and his best friend Daryl set out for Florida. Their dream vacation had finally arrived. Fay considered the trip and decided she was not concerned about the boys' safety. After all, Jim was 17, about to start his senior year in high school, and Daryl was 19. Certainly the boys were old enough to take a 1-week vacation. She set her mind to the task at hand, dipping the slices of soft bread into the mixture of egg and milk and placing them on the hot buttered griddle. The sun shone bright in the early morning sky, and the temperature had already soared into the 80s. She and her husband, Roy, loved summertime in Metamora, Michigan, and this day, like so many others, was going to be a beauty. The rolling deep green hills, maple trees in full bloom, and long warm days of fishing or horseback riding or swimming at the nearby lake. There would be family picnics, barbecues, and endless get-togethers with the dozens of relatives who lived less than an hour away. Metamora summers made the snowy winter months tolerable. But for two teenage boys who had spent a lifetime of summers in Metamora, the town offered very little in the way of entertainment. And so the dream vacation had been born. 1 week in which the boys would drive to Florida, spend a few days at Daytona Beach, and then visit Disney World in Orlando. They had planned the trips for months, and Faye knew her son had never been more excited. "Hey, Mom, did you wash my blue jeans?" Jim walked past the kitchen wearing only a pair of shorts and headed toward the utility room, where he began searching frantically through a load of clothes in the dryer. "I don't see 'em," he yelled. His body was now partially inside the dryer. "Hey, Mom, can you help me here? I need my jeans." At the same time, the youngest member of the Boucher family, 7-month-old Christy, began to cry. Okay, I'm coming," Faye said, flipping a batch of French toast and smiling to herself as she moved briskly toward the baby's playpen. "Be there in a minute, Jim." Faye easily lifted her infant daughter onto her hip as she headed toward the utility room. She was a slim, pretty woman whose body showed few signs of having had 5 children. Tousling her son's brown hair as she walked past him, she picked up 2 neatly folded pairs of blue jeans off a folding table. "This what you're looking for?" Jim grinned. He was a slender, muscular boy, 5'10", 140 pounds, with shoulder-length brown hair and sparkling brown eyes much like his mother's. "Why don't you get Daryl and come to breakfast?" Faye said. "It's almost ready." "Good idea," Jim said, setting the jeans down. "Can you help me pack after we eat?" "Sure. Now go get Daryl." "Thanks, Mom." Jim flashed her a smile from beneath the sparse mustache he had grown a few months earlier, and then dashed back down the hallway toward his bedroom. Faye wasn't entirely pleased with the mustache, but she figured it was harmless. "I'm nearly a man now," he had told his parents when they both raised an eyebrow at the growth on his upper lip. "It makes me look older, don't you think?" "What's the hurry, Jim?" she had said then. "You're only 17. Jim had always been mature for his age, and now he seemed to want nothing more than to be treated like an adult. But Faye feared that growing up in Metamora had not prepared him for the world he wanted so desperately to explore. Another reason why this trip was such a good idea, she told herself as she set the table. It would give Jim a chance to feel independent. In a matter of minutes, both teenage boys were sitting at the butcher block kitchen table, consuming mountains of French toast, syrup, and melted butter. Daryl and Jim had been friends for 7 years, and although Daryl was 2 years older, neither boy had been away from home by himself. Daryl was polite, a good-looking teenager who was the youngest of 5 kids and lived just a few houses down on Baldwin Road. He had been working as a machinist for the past year and was about to begin his first paid vacation. He had brought his 35mm camera and planned to capture a lot of memories in the coming week. The excitement in the sprawling kitchen was palpable. "I think we're going to need at least a few bags of this French toast for the road," Daryl said as he stood up and took his plate to the kitchen sink. He turned to Jim. "Maybe she can come with us, just so we can get a good breakfast each day." Faye smiled. "Somehow I don't think you want me and 4 kids tagging along to Daytona Beach." Jim stood up and set his empty plate in the sink. "Oh, we wouldn't mind at all," He grinned, leaning over and kissing his mother on the cheek. "Hey, Mom, you ready to help me pack?" Faye wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Let's get to it while Christy's taking a nap," she said. For the next 20 minutes, she gathered clean clothes from the utility room and helped Jim pack his spacious blue suitcase. In addition to the necessities, he was taking several T-shirts and a pair of shorts, a few tank tops, a bathing suit, and the blue jeans. "Plenty of room for souvenirs," he said as he and Faye stood side by side, surveying the contents. "Well, don't buy too much," Faye reminded him gently. "You have a car on order, remember?" Jim had won a statewide bowling tournament in January, and 3 months ago had received a check for $10,000 as prize money. He had decided to take just $400 on the trip and set aside the remainder to pay for the brand new 1979 Camaro he had ordered. "Who said anything about buying souvenirs?" Jim said. "I'm bringing home live crabs." He looked down at his little brother John, who had joined them a few minutes earlier. John was about to enter 1st grade, and he loved his oldest brother dearly. "You want a crab, John?" There was mischief in Jim's voice. The small boy's eyes lit up at the idea. "Yeah, bring me a crab, okay, Jim?" Jim laughed as he caught his mother's disapproving expression. "Okay, but I think Mom will make us keep it outside." "Yeah, I'll make a cage for him," John said as he raced out of the room, intent on finding a place where he could store a crab. Seconds later they could hear him singing happily. "I'm getting a crab, I'm getting a crab, Jim's going to get me a crab." The packing finished, Jim and Daryl hauled their suitcases outside and placed them in the trunk of Daryl's 1972 Chevrolet Nova. Although not flashy, the red sports car was easy to recognize with its shiny black vinyl top. Jim's father, Roy Boucher, had said goodbye to his son that morning before he left for work, and Daryl's family had said their goodbyes earlier also. Now the rest of the Boucher family lined up in the family driveway to watch Daryl and Jim leave. Timothy, 15 years old, laughed and playfully wrestled with Stephen, just 2 years younger than him. John, meanwhile, hovered beside Jim, struggling to help him pack a stack of towels and a blanket into the back seat of the car. The child worshipped his oldest brother and had not stopped talking about the idea of getting a crab when he returned. "Are you sure, Jim?" the little boy asked, huge brown eyes searching Jim's for an answer. "A crab? A real live crab?" Jim crouched down on one knee and put his hands on John's shoulders. "I'll try my best to find one for you, and you be a good boy for Mom. Is that a deal?" John nodded, but then his lower lip began to quiver, and a single tear escaped as his eyes overflowed. "How long is a week?" Jim pulled the child into a hug as the others watched from nearby, and Faye felt a lump rising in her throat. "Not very long," Jim said softly. "I'll be back before you know it." John nodded, and his sudden sadness seemed to pass as quickly as it had come on. Jim stood up and waved goodbye to his other brothers as Daryl climbed into the driver's seat and shut the car door. Faye walked up to Jim and took him in her arms. Christy was up from her nap, and she sat balanced once again on Faye's hip. The three of them stayed close for a long moment until finally Jim pulled away. "I love you, Mom," he said, leaning toward her and kissing her. The lump in Faye's throat had grown larger, and she was unable to speak. Her eyes grew damp, and Jim could see how emotional she had become. Faye smiled in spite of her feelings. "I love you, honey," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Don't worry, Mom," he said, looking intently into her eyes. "We'll be fine." Faye nodded quickly, swallowing hard. She did not want to cry. It was ridiculous to be so concerned over Jim's departure. But he had never been away from home, never been on his own without the help of his parents. "Please call when you get there, okay?" she said finally, forcing herself to sound casual. The boys planned to travel more than 500 miles that afternoon and arrive in Daytona Beach sometime late that night. Faye figured she should be getting their phone call at that time. "We will," he said, "soon as we get there." Jim kissed her one more time and smiled. "Have fun," Faye whispered, brushing her son's hair back from his eyes and smiling in return. "We'll miss you." "Me too." Jim slid into the passenger seat and waved at his family. "Bye," he shouted. "See you in a week." Faye looked hard at Jim as the car pulled out of the driveway. He looked young and carefree, about to begin the adventure of a lifetime. A week wasn't long at all, and then they would be back, sharing tall tales of their time in Florida. She raised her arm up once more, waving one final time. "Bye, Jim," she said softly. "Love you." And then she and her 4 remaining children stayed in the driveway waving to the boys until the red Chevy Nova with the shiny black top turned off Baldwin Road and disappeared from sight. Chapter 2. The Eagles sounded loud and clear over Daryl's new car stereo, and the boys sang along as they drove south down the interstate. "I've got a peaceful, easy feeling, and I know she won't let me down, 'cause I'm already standing on the ground." When the song ended, Jim reached into the back seat and grabbed a paper bag. "Sandwich time," he said, tossing one to Daryl. "How long have we been driving?" Daryl glanced at his watch. 3 hours. Still got a long way to go." Jim and Daryl were halfway across Ohio when they finished the sandwiches. They had made them the night before in an effort to save time and money, and so their only stops would be to buy gasoline for the Nova. Jim looked out the window and wondered what Jamie was doing. He wished that there had been some way she could have come on this trip, but he knew the idea had been impossible. Her parents would never have allowed her to spend a week's vacation with him. They had been dating very seriously for the past 4 months, but in many ways their relationship was still more like a friendship than anything else. They kissed a lot and occasionally made out after a date, but she drew the line beyond that. Jim sighed out loud as he thought of her. She was a beautiful girl, with a heart that seemed perfect for his own. Daryl glanced at his friend. "Oh, no, thinking of Jamie already, aren't you?" Jim laughed. "Okay, you caught me." "Don't worry, Jim. You'll survive without seeing her for 1 week. I promise." In fact, the trip to Daytona Beach had been Jamie's idea. She and a girlfriend had driven to Daytona during spring break several months earlier. They had spent the week lying on the hot, white sand and splashing about in the clear, warm Atlantic Ocean. She had come home tan and bursting with enthusiasm. "It's great," she had said, her hands gesturing in excitement. "Beaches as far as you can see, and everyone's our age. Everyone. It's like teenagers run the place. We must have met 100 people. And there's a boardwalk and the shops. You got to go." Jim had talked the idea over with Daryl, who had been to Florida once before with his parents, and in a matter of days, the idea of a dream vacation had been conceived. Jim stared out the car window as they passed one farm after another. Yes, he could imagine marrying Jamie one day. She was that kind of girl, a sweet, family-oriented girl who didn't mess around with her boyfriends the way some girls did. Jim smiled as he thought of her. It was probably just as well that she hadn't pursued the idea of joining them on the Florida vacation. A week of staring at Jamie in a skimpy bikini would probably have given him heart failure. Besides, this week was going to be a special time for him and Daryl, just like old times. "How's it feel to be on vacation?" Jim asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Daryl shrugged and grinned. "Considering I'm pulling in a paycheck for spending a week in Florida, it feels pretty good." Jim laughed and looked out the window again. He and Daryl didn't have to spend a lot of time talking in order to enjoy each other's company. They shared a love for the same kind of music, they participated in similar activities, and they had grown up playing together on the same street. They were almost like brothers. The only problem was that for the past year, since Daryl had started working full-time as a machinist, they had spent much less time together. Once Jim had resigned himself to Daryl's new schedule, he had gotten a job also, working as a part-time clerk at Kmart, so that he could save up extra money for the trip to Florida. Even after he received his bowling prize money, Jim did not consider quitting his job. The trip was going to be expensive, and he wanted to make as much money as possible before the school year started. "Jim, why don't you relax a little and enjoy this summer?" his mother had said. "You work all the time." "I like to work," Jim had insisted. "It makes me feel good to know I can make money and buy my own things. I've had enough summers where all I do is sit around. Besides, I want to save for the trip." With their heavy work schedules, the summer had gone by quickly, and then, suddenly, the trip was upon them. By that time, Jim had saved an additional $500, of which he kept $400 in cash for the trip, and put the rest in the bank with his prize money. The car was traveling at a steady speed, and Jim casually felt his wallet to make sure he'd brought it. Then he remembered his traveler's checks. Suddenly he couldn't remember if he had taken them or not. "Oh, no," he said. He rummaged through his duffel bag. Daryl watched his friend with a puzzled look on his face. "What's up?" Jim felt the smooth plastic check holder tucked in the bottom of the bag, and he released a deep sigh as he held up the traveler's checks so Daryl could see them. "For a second there, I thought I forgot these." "Glad you didn't," Daryl said. He had resumed singing and was clearly enjoying the trip. He had several $100s in cash with him, but Jim's parents had insisted that one of them take some money in traveler's checks. "You never know, son," his father had said. "You could lose your money or your wallet might get taken. Having traveler's checks, you won't have to worry about that. It's a good idea." Jim had agreed, and now, 200 miles from home, he was glad to know he hadn't forgotten them. "Tell me again what you remember about Daytona Beach," Jim said, turning sideways in his seat and reaching over and turning down the radio. Daryl laughed softly. Jim had never been away from home except for family vacations to visit grandparents or other relatives. Now he seemed excited just traveling through Ohio. Daryl could only imagine what he would think about Daytona Beach once they got there. "Well, I'll tell you this much," Daryl said. "There are definitely a lot of girls, and none of them are wearing much, if you know what I mean." Jim laughed and felt his face flush with embarrassment. Jamie had warned him about the girls. "I know you're on vacation," she had said lightly, "but keep your hands to yourself, hear?" Jim had agreed completely. He wouldn't mind sitting on a warm beach watching bikini-clad girls stroll by, but he wasn't looking to get involved with any of them, not with Jamie waiting back home. "What else?" he asked, anxious to change the subject. "Well, they have parties on the beach," Daryl said. "You know, at the motels up and down the strip." The idea of attending a beach party sounded wonderful to Jim. He had been to high school parties and get-togethers at friends' houses in Metamora and nearby Lapeer, but he had never been to a party like he figured they would have at Daytona Beach. "And the water's warm, right?" Jim continued. "You bet it is," Daryl said, grinning at the memory of the warm Atlantic water. "Nothing like our lakes back home." The boys slipped into an easy-going quiet, and Daryl turned the radio up. Minutes later they were both singing as loud as they could, their windows open so that the warm breeze whirled throughout the car. They were on vacation, and life felt so very, very good. Hours later they passed a sign that read, "Daytona Beach, 7 miles." Faye and Roy Boucher had finished dinner, done the dishes, and gotten the younger children in bed. Now, finally, they were alone at the kitchen table. They talked about Roy's workday and Christie's latest accomplishments. Then, after a while, they slipped into making occasional small talk. But every few minutes, Faye glanced up at the clock on the wall. "Why haven't they called?" she asked herself. They should be there by now, and they definitely should have called. Finally, Roy took her hand in his and smiled. "I know what you're thinking, honey," he said, "but it's only 10:15. The boys are probably almost there, and they'll be calling us any minute." Faye nodded slowly. "I know," she said. She was quiet a moment as she sorted her thoughts. "I'm not really worried. It's just that I wish I would have asked them to call sooner. Or maybe just to call at a specific time. That way we would be sure they would call at 10 o'clock, and we wouldn't have to sit here worrying." Roy raised an eyebrow. "Who's worried? I thought you weren't worried about a thing." Faye laughed at her own contradiction and moved closer to her husband, setting her head on his shoulder. "Do you think they're okay?" she asked softly. Roy stroked his wife's hair. "Yes, sweetheart, I do. They're big boys. They're smart, and they're very responsible. They'll do just fine." Faye nodded absently. "It's just that it's so far away. Maybe they should have flown or something." Roy laughed. "Honey, really, they're going to be fine." Glancing up at the clock again, Faye sighed. "I just wish they'd call, that's all." "Maybe you should pray about this, just so you won't worry so much," Roy said, seeing that his wife was still nervous. "You're right. God doesn't want us fretting like this." The Bouchers were devout Christians whose children had learned more from watching their faith in action than from any of the hundreds of Sunday school lessons they'd received. The Bouchers lived their faith, believing that to be anything less than devoted to God and his son Jesus was to make a mockery of Christianity. As a result, they did not merely participate in a religion. They shared a relationship with God, and each of their children had grown to do the same thing. 15 minutes passed, and Faye spent much of that time in prayer, begging God for the boys' phone call. Still, when the telephone rang, she released a sigh of relief as she jumped up to answer it. "Hello?" "Hey, Mom," Jim said, his voice sounding as clear as if he were standing in the next room. Faye felt instant relief as she strained to hear Jim above the sound of traffic in the background. "We're here. Made it safely." "That's wonderful," Faye said. "How was the trip?" "Well, I have to tell you," Jim said, "that's one long drive." Jim laughed. "But now that we're here, it's great. The water is so warm, Mom, you wouldn't believe it." Roy had moved into the other room and was listening in on the extension. "You mean you've already been down to the beach?" he asked. "Oh, hi, Dad," Jim said. "Yeah, just for a minute. We wanted to feel the water before we called you. And guess what?" At that instant, an operator interrupted the call. "I'm sorry, but you are out of time. Please hang up or deposit more money." "Operator, can you reverse the charges?" Roy asked. "Yes, that'll be fine. I'll reverse them starting now." "Thank you," he said. "Jim, are you there?" "Yeah. Hey, thanks, Dad. I'm out of change. Anyway, guess what I found?" "We give up," Faye said lightly, laughing as she enjoyed her son's obvious excitement. "A crab. Can you believe it? Just walking along the beach. I saw it in the moonlight and caught it. So you can tell John that I'll be bringing him the crab I promised. Okay?" Faye wrinkled her nose at the thought of having a sea crab in her house, but she didn't want to dampen Jim's enthusiasm. "I'll tell him," she said. "I'm sure he'll be thrilled." Roy laughed. He could just imagine little John asking Jim to bring him a live crab from Florida. "Son, tell us where you are." "Okay, we just got into Daytona Beach," Jim said, raising his voice above the sound of the heavy traffic. "We're going to drive down the strip a ways and find a motel, and that's about it for tonight." "All right," Roy said. "Well, be careful, son, and have a good time." "And please call us," Faye added. "I will. I'll keep in touch and let you know how the trip's going." "We'd appreciate that," Roy said. "Especially your mother. You know how she worries." Yeah, Jim tried to make light of his parents' concerns. Don't worry about us, Mom. We'll be fine. We're having a great time already.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?